In the first 3 installments of this 4-part series, we took a look at certain mysterious phenomena which appear in different and unrelated folkloric traditions, which each tradition explains in a different way. In this 4th and final video, we'll take a look at unsolved disappearances which occur in very particular locations, and the various explanations which folklore provides for them. Newfoundland folk tradition contends that children and lone travelers who wander alone in particular locations, ecosystems, or topographical features run the risk of being abducted by the fairies and taken to their strange otherworldly abode. Among the most dangerous of these places are swamps and berry patches. In Strange Terrain, Barbara Rietti includes a number of folktales and personal stories which support this oddly specific fear. "There were marshes nearby, on the front of the island where we lived," said one informant, and stories were told about the fairies which lived there. "There was one particular piece of marshland which used to shake like jelly when we would run across it. Stories were told that it would open up and swallow us, like it had done to other people." Another anecdote was provided by the aforementioned Mrs. Marie Meany, who told her granddaughter Colleen about a young orphan girl whom another couple had adopted. One day, after having some local ladies over for tea, the girl's stepmother asked her to shake off the tablecloth outside. So she took the tablecloth and went out, Mrs. Meany said, shook it out around the door, and just outside the door was a little place raspberries used to grow. And she stopped to pick a few, you know. Pick them and eat them, pick them and eat them. And gosh, she never came back. She never came back, and she never came back for 2 or 3 days. And when she came back, Mrs. said to her, "Where did you go? Do you know how long you've been gone? You were gone 3 days and a night." She couldn't believe it, you know. She was frightened. But the fairies brought her back. Another story treats for the mother of one Bernadine Flynn of Avalon, Newfoundland. One day, the story goes, when Mrs. Flynn's mother was walking across the barrens to bring dinner to her husband, who worked on the railroad line, she stopped to pick a few strawberries. Anyhow, when she looked up, she saw the fairies with their babies. They were running across the barren. The fairies were dressed in beautiful clothes, which had many bright colors. Mrs. Flynn's mother was very frightened, but since she had her rosary beads with her, she started to say it and the fairies left. Rietti included another tale told to her personally by an elderly woman who requested anonymity for fear of ridicule. One morning, when she was about 13 years old, the informant's mother went berry picking with one of her friends. They hadn't been long about their business when the friend looked up to find that the storyteller's mother had disappeared. The friend searched for the woman all throughout the surrounding forest, but was unable to find any clue as to where she might have gone. At 9:30 that evening, to her family's relief and astonishment, the missing woman hobbled through her own front door, disheveled and exhausted. She was all doubled over, the informant said. Her hair was all over her eyes, one shoe on and the other foot bare, and she looked right gone, you know. Oh my, I couldn't describe to you what she was like. The informant's mother explained that, early that morning, after filling her basket with berries, she headed over to the larger bucket that she and her friend were sharing, with the intention of dumping the fruits of her labors therein. During the short walk to the bucket, the woman lost consciousness and lapsed into a dreamlike state. When she came to, she found herself walking along an unfamiliar brook in a particular stretch of barrens, at a location which later proved to lie 10 miles from the berry patch, with her basket gone, her coat gone, and one of her shoes missing. Although she was never able to recall what had happened to her during her trance-like spell, most Newfoundlanders who heard her experience implicitly believed that she had been taken by the fairies. Fortunately, not all fairy abductees are so ill-used by their captors. In her book, Rietti included a number of brief allusions to incidents in which the abductee, who in these cases is invariably a little girl, was fed, sheltered, and treated kindly by her diminutive kidnappers in an uncharacteristic display of goodwill. One girl from the tiny community of Petite Forte, for example, disappeared for a week. When she returned, she said that she was with the good people. They were fairies, see, and they gave her stuff of the hills. They picked berries, and that kept her alive. Another informant, who hailed from the town of Cupids, wrote, "Years ago, a girl disappeared from the town. She was 11 years old, and after searching for over a week, they had given up any hope of finding her alive. However, they did find her in a clearing of wood sitting alone. She explained that she had been fed and sheltered by a group of small men." Although it has nothing to do with swamps or berry patches, there is another story in Rieti's book, which is worth recounting here, for reasons which will soon become obvious. In the early 1900s, a 3-year-old girl named Minnie Keith vanished from the town of Colonet, Newfoundland, and remained missing for 9 days. On the last day, a traveler who was returning to the Rock, as Newfoundland is sometimes called, from a trip to the United States, found the little girl playing in a sandpit. Although it had rained during the 9 days she was gone, Rieti wrote, she was neither wet nor hungry. The general consensus in Colonet was that she had been taken in by the fairies. Over the past decade, a former Californian police officer named David Paulides has single-handedly invented a new class of folklore revolving around missing people. The implied premise of this modern mythology, branded Missing 411, is that certain unsolved disappearances can be attributed to the predations of some mysterious force which prowls the wilderness of North America, taking its victims without leaving any olfactory traces behind. To be classified as a Missing 411 case, a disappearance must satisfy at least one of more than a dozen conditions, which Paulides calls profile points. One of these conditions is that swamps or bogs feature in the victim's disappearance, or the search and rescue operation which succeeds it. In the introduction to his 2019 book, Missing 411 Canada, Paulides writes, "Some readers will find the fact that missing people are located in the middle of swamps and bogs a highly unusual place to discover people. I have lost count of the number of times this fact has proven itself to be true. Marshes are one of those places that the general public won't casually wander. It could be considered one of those locations where few people ever trek. It is also a place discounted by many SAR personnel as too difficult for the victim to travel." Another of Paulides' profile points is berries. In the introduction to his 2012 book, Missing 411, Eastern United States, he writes, "The fact that berries and berry bushes play a continuous role in many disappearances is overwhelming. People disappear and are found in the middle of berry bushes. They go missing while they are picking berries, and some are found eating berries. The association between some missing people and berries cannot be denied." One berry picker whose disappearance Paulides touched on in Missing 411 Canada was 58-year-old George Wanke. In his subchapter on Wanke's disappearance, Paulides cites an article published in the July 27, 1935 issue of the Winnipeg Free Press. This short column, entitled "Berry Picker Lost in Bush in Region of Lac du Bonnet," reads, "George Wanke, aged 58 years, of Beauséjour, is missing in the bush near Brightstone, about 10 miles due west of Lac du Bonnet. Wanke, with a party of about 24 others, left Beauséjour by truck Thursday morning for the Brightstone district on a berry-picking excursion. They arrived at their chosen point around noon and spread out on their berry hunting, which was to last until 5 o'clock, having selected a meeting place. The remainder of the party waited for the return of Wanke until 7 o'clock, when they returned to Beauséjour for more help to search for the missing man. 3 truckloads left for Brightstone Friday morning to make a last intensive hunt, but according to the latest information, no word has been received, either at Lac du Bonnet or Beauséjour, as to Wanke having been found." A little more than a month later, another Manitoban berry picker vanished under mysterious circumstances. On Thursday, September 5, 1935, 5-year-old Jack Pike disappeared from a dense wooded area near St. Norbert, a monastery located about 12 miles south of Winnipeg, Manitoba at that time, somewhere between the St. Mary's Road and the Red River. Jack's father, a CN Railway employee named Charles Pike, had a day off work and had decided to take his wife's friend Lily Jones, his son Jack, and his youngest daughter Charlotte out to St. Norbert to pick blueberries and chokecherries. 5 minutes into their excursion, at about 2 o'clock p.m., Mr. and Mrs. Charles Pike heard their son emit a stifled shriek nearby, about a mile from the riverbank. He screamed as if he was terrified, his mother told reporters. It seemed to be choked off in the middle. By the time we reached the spot where the scream sounded from, he was gone. There wasn't a trace of him. He'd vanished into the air, and we haven't seen a sign of him since. Charles Pike spent the next 3 hours tramping through the surrounding bush, calling frantically for his son. Eventually conceding that the situation was serious, he reluctantly postponed his own search in order to call the local RCMP from the phone of a nearby farmer. He spent the night searching for Jack, and continued to search the following day, aided by 40 friends and neighbors from the nearby town of Saint Vital. The searchers were drenched by intermittent rainfall, inclement weather following the disappearances being another of Paulides' profile points. Headed by local RCMP officer Constable H.M. Weir and Captain D.G. Gallagher of the Saint Vital Fire Department, the search and rescue effort continued throughout the weekend, gaining 20 additional recruits from the surrounding area, along with the complement of local volunteers who organized the camp kitchen for the searchers. Some newspaper articles indicate that the search and rescue party eventually swelled to a 2,000-man operation, supplemented by an airplane, members of the 2nd Canadian Motor Machine Gun Brigade, and several boats, whose occupants scanned the shores of the Red River. So thick is the brush in that district, wrote journalist Ben Malkin for the Winnipeg Free Press, and so difficult is it to maintain a sense of direction, that several of the search parties themselves were at times and for short periods lost. Even one of the police dogs used by searching parties became lost for a short time when it broke away from the main body. At intervals, searchers who broke away and struck into the bush by themselves would lose all sense of their whereabouts, and unable to reach the highway until they came by other searchers, who would indicate the correct direction to them. Constable Weir was baffled as to what might have befallen the subject of his search. A contemporary newspaper article contended that he considered animal predation unlikely, since the area is fairly well populated, and searchers found no trace of anything larger than rabbits or grouse. He also considered the possibility of kidnapping too remote to seriously pursue, as the Pike family were strangers in the district. They had no known enemies, and their position in life precluded the idea of ransom. Another article stated that one Mr. Drysdale, an experienced woodsman, confessed he was beaten by the mystifying disappearance of the lost boy, while searchers Larry Bates and Charlie Oakley of Saint Vital were equally baffled. On Monday, September 9, 1935, at 12:45 p.m., an unemployed carpenter named Ole Olson, who had assisted in the search, discovered little Jack Pike curled up beneath a clump of willows, about 150 yards from the Red River, at a location 2 miles away from where he was seen. He was unconscious, severely dehydrated, and barely clinging to life. Searchers gently carried him about half a mile to St. Mary's Road, where an ambulance rushed him to St. Boniface Hospital in Winnipeg. The finding of the boy culminates one of the most intensive searches for a lost person in the history of our province, concluded a front-page article in that day's issue of the Winnipeg Evening Tribune. More than 2,000 men and women had combed the bush. Searchers present at the scene of the boy's discovery, seeing that Jack had not been injured by anything aside from privation and the rough Manitoban undergrowth, suspected that the 5-year-old, on the day of his disappearance, had probably panicked when he found himself unable to see his parents, ran into the bush in the opposite direction of his family, and became lost. Jack Pike flickered in and out of consciousness on the ambulance ride to the hospital. Upon arrival, his father, Charles, on the advice of Dr. George Shapira, gave him a blood transfusion. Shortly after the operation, Jack came to, and glanced feebly at his father. "I think he recognized me," Charles Pike is quoted as having said. "He put his hand in mine, and his eyes seemed to light up when he saw me." For a few hours, Jack seemed to be winning his plucky battle, wrote another front-page article in the Winnipeg Evening Tribune. But at 11 o'clock, he sank into unconsciousness, and injections of adrenaline failed to revive him. His parents had left for their home when their son's condition appeared better. They were hastily summoned, to arrive just as Jack died. On Friday, September 13, 1935, Jack Pike was laid to rest in St. Vital's Elmwood Cemetery. After a somber funeral, which was attended by hundreds of those who had participated in the search, the tiny coffin was lowered into the grave, the melancholy sky and bitter wind reflecting the sentiments of those who would come to pay their respects. Another Manitoban disappearance in Paulides' book, which eerily evokes the old Newfoundlandic tales of fairy abduction, is that of 4-year-old Betty Wolfram, who vanished on May 15, 1934, 1 year before the disappearances of Jack Pike and George Wanke, near the rural community of Moosehorn, just east of Lake Manitoba. That day, her father Carl placed a sleeping 4-year-old in a carriage in front of his farmhouse before heading into the field to seed. George's wife, who would typically have looked after Betty while he worked, had taken their 16-year-old daughter Helen into town to see a doctor. Although the specific nature of Helen's malady was never publicly disclosed, some newspapers suggested that it had something to do with an indecent assault, which Helen claimed to have suffered 16 days earlier at the hands of 2 local boys. When George Wolfram returned from his farmhouse, he found that Betty was missing from the carriage. At first, he was not unduly alarmed, and began calling out for his daughter, suspecting that she must have woken up from her nap and climbed down to play. When no answers were forthcoming, however, he grew increasingly worried. George's wife joined the search when she and Helen returned from town later that day. All night, the husband and wife searched for their missing daughter, calling out her name with lanterns in hand as they slogged through the sloughs and swamps surrounding their farmhouse. In the morning, the Wolframs alerted the RCMP. Carl Wolfram and 100 men from the surrounding area, under the direction of Constable R.S. Smith and Sergeant George Clifford of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, proceeded to comb the so-called Spear Hill district surrounding the Wolfram farm for any sign of Betty, all the while pummeled by torrential rain. Betty's mother told the Mounties in charge of the case that she suspected her daughter had been kidnapped by the family of one of the boys whom Helen claimed had attacked her, as revenge for their formal complaint. After 5 days of fruitless searching, during which the surrounding area was pummeled with torrential rain, Betty was found wandering in a swamp about 2 miles from her home, whimpering, "Daddy, Daddy." The story of her discovery is one of the many strange elements of which her case is comprised. The man who found her, a local farmer named Roy Roslin, headed into the swamp on a hunch, later telling police that he walked into a certain spot at which a man had been shot to death several years earlier in a dispute over the ownership of a truck. Before heading out that day, he allegedly told his wife that he feared he might not come back alive, telling her, without offering any further explanation, that if he did manage to return, he expected he would be all broken up. Like the unnamed mother in one of Barbara Rietti's fairy stories, Betty was discovered without her coat and the red hat she had been wearing on the day of her disappearance, and was found to be wearing only one shoe. Dr. Frank Walken of Ashern, Manitoba, the physician who subsequently examined her, reported, "Examination of the child reveals little loss of flesh, and no evidence of dehydration. Furthermore, in view of the fact there have been so many mosquitoes present, it is significant that there are no bites or scratches present. In my opinion, this child has had food, water, and some shelter for the past 3 to 4 days, as I do not believe that any child who has always been delicate could have withstood this long exposure and show so little trace." Other newspaper articles indicated that Betty was found completely dry, and that her clothing and one remaining shoe were quite clean and pristine, considering the duration of her backcountry ordeal. An article in the Montreal Gazette declared that Betty remained in a state of terror following her rescue, and that she hardly spoke upon arriving home, spending most of her time sleeping and whimpering softly. Another article contended that she exhibited a terror of all men, and would not even go near her father, though she had always been his favorite child, and was used to accompanying him on all his tasks about the farm. Eventually, Betty told her mother that, on the day of her discovery, a man had placed her in the slough, and told her to walk in a certain direction which proved to lead to her family's barn. On May 22nd, 2 days after her return, the RCMP interviewed Betty Wolfram, in an effort to shed some light on her mysterious absence. The long-awaited conversation with the little girl, however, was a distinct disappointment to the hopes of the police that she would supply the key to the mystery, wrote a journalist for the Winnipeg Evening Tribune who witnessed the interview. No longer nervous or frightened of men, Betty prattled gaily to the officers and newspaper men, but vouchsafed no coherent or significant information as to her doings during her 5 days' absence from home. "The case is baffling," concluded an article in the Winnipeg Evening Tribune, "and newspapermen and police alike are met with vague answers and a general air of mystery at every turn. They are convinced that there are some in the district who know more about the affair than they have told." One final element to the story was provided by a neighboring farmer named George Romaine. Romaine told the Royal Canadian Mounted Policeman who investigated the case that, during Betty's absence, one of his milk cows returned from the bush 3 days in a row, milked dry. Discounting the family feud angle, if Betty's disappearance had taken place in Newfoundland, it would have been considered a classic case of fairy abduction. As mentioned earlier, in other Newfoundlandic stories in which young girls were supposedly abducted by fairies, the victims were found completely dry, despite the areas having been subjected to heavy rain, much like Betty Wolfram. Many victims supposedly abducted by Newfoundlandic fairies went missing or were discovered in swamps, like Betty Wolfram. Nearly every abduction survivor in Newfoundland fairy lore returned to civilization changed in some way, as the quiet, whimpering Betty Wolfram appeared to be. And Newfoundland fairies were said to milk cows from time to time, as was George Romaine's cow in the story of Betty Wolfram. Interestingly, Betty's story takes place just 50 kilometers, or about 30 miles, west of a district called New Iceland, whose inhabitants once believed that Huldafolk, or elves, inhabited the wilderness surrounding their farmhouses. Thank you for watching. If you can think of any other strange phenomena for which different folkloric traditions ascribe different causes, please let me know in the comments below.